When most people picture someone with no friends, they imagine a person who has been rejected, abandoned, or left behind by life. They assume weakness. They assume fragility. They assume failure. But every once in a while, you meet someone who stands alone and doesn't seem diminished by it. Someone quiet, self-contained, and difficult to read. Someone who once poured their emotions into everyone around them but now guards their inner world like sacred ground. These are not hermits, misanthropes, or bitter recluses. These are empath loners, and Carl Jung would argue that they are not running from others, they are returning to themselves. Their solitude is not a wound. It is a threshold. And crossing it changes everything. It rarely begins as defiance. In the beginning, they were the person everyone called at 2 in the morning because they would always answer. They were the emotional anchor of their families, the friend who absorbed every crisis, the partner who sensed every unspoken feeling in the room. For most of their life, they lived without armor. Their nervous system stayed open like a door that was never locked. Jung described the psyche as self-regulating, always seeking equilibrium when pushed to extremes. For the empath, constant exposure to unfiltered emotion creates a slow internal overload. They don't choose solitude at first. Their psyche chooses it for them. What the outside world interprets as isolation is actually a protective recalibration, the mind pulling its energy inward to keep the self from dissolving into everyone else's expectations. To understand why they withdraw, you have to understand what it costs to live as a perpetual receiver of emotional data. Where most people hear words, the empath hears subtext. Where others see a smile, they register the tension beneath the lips. They feel the climate of a room the way others feel the weather. Subtle changes in tone, hesitation, or emotional friction register as visceral sensations. For years, they believed this sensitivity was simply who they were, a gift they were obligated to share. They stayed in conversations long after their body felt drained. They soothed arguments that did not belong to them. They allowed other people's storms to live inside their chest. That accumulation eventually reaches saturation. The retreat that follows is not social avoidance. It is psychological oxygen. People misinterpret this withdrawal because they view it through their own fear of being alone. They imagine loneliness where there is actually relief. They assume emptiness where there is finally quiet. The empath loner did not vanish because they disliked people. They stepped away because their identity had become fused with the emotional needs of others. Jung warned that when a person over-identifies with their social role, they lose contact with their authentic self. The empath's role was to listen, to stabilize, to heal. Eventually that role became a cage. Solitude becomes the only space where they can hear something other than the noise of the collective psyche. It is not an escape. It is a homecoming. But their story is not one of innocence. It is a story of exhaustion, and of a silent debt accumulated over years of self-erasure. Empaths don't lose friends accidentally. They lose them because those relationships were built on an invisible contract. I will absorb your pain, and in return you will keep me useful. In childhood, many empaths served as emotional regulators for unstable environments. Safety was earned through compliance, attentiveness, and self-sacrifice. That pattern follows them into adulthood, where they become the good listener, the peacekeeper, the one who never asks for anything. The mask becomes so convincing that others forget it is a mask at all. But the unconscious keeps a ledger, and eventually the cost becomes unbearable. What looks like distance is actually accountability. They recognize that their constant giving was not kindness, but an inability to tolerate the discomfort of others. Their boundaries were porous because they confused empathy with self-abandonment. When they finally withdraw, it is not an act of punishment. It is a repossession of energy. They are not shutting the world out. They are calling themselves back in. Old friends often react with confusion or resentment, not because they cared deeply, but because they lost access to a resource they took for granted. The empath is no longer available on demand, and that absence exposes how one-sided the relationship truly was. This shift becomes even more profound when they encounter their shadow. Jung described the shadow as all the traits we repress to maintain our self-image. For empaths, the shadow is not cruelty or malice, it is anger, refusal, indifference, and the right to say no. For years, they buried those impulses because they believed that goodness required endless tolerance. But exhaustion cracks the facade. Resentment seeps in. They begin to feel a cold clarity toward people who constantly drain them. They fantasize about walking away, and one day, they do. The transformation does not come from becoming harder, but from acknowledging that their softness also requires protection. A harmless person is one who lacks the ability to assert themselves. A peaceful person is one who possesses that ability and chooses carefully when to use it. The empath loner becomes peaceful. They are fully capable of detaching, of withholding attention, of refusing to play roles that compromise their integrity. This is what makes them unsettling to manipulators. When guilt, obligation, or emotional drama no longer triggers automatic compliance, the social mechanisms controlling them collapse. You cannot control someone who has accepted that being seen as selfish is sometimes necessary to survive. Standing near them feels unusual because they have stopped participating in unconscious validation rituals. Most interactions rely on silent agreements: I affirm your identity, and you affirm mine. The empath loner no longer reflexively mirrors others. They do not perform approval simply to keep the mood comfortable. They remain still, and that stillness forces people to confront themselves. Many mistake this neutrality for judgment, but it is not judgment, it is absence of performance. Their presence functions like a clear surface where projections bounce back to their owner. People either awaken in that reflection, or retreat from it. There is also a decisive psychological threshold they cross, the point where they stop feeling first and thinking later. Before, empathy was a reflex. Now it becomes a choice. Jung called this individuation, the process of becoming a distinct, whole self rather than a fragment of the collective. The empath begins evaluating interactions not by emotional obligation, but by truth. Does this exchange honor who I am, or does it pull me back into an old script? They allow people to face their own consequences instead of cushioning every fall. This does not make them colder. It makes them honest. Once they reach this state, returning to conventional friendship becomes nearly impossible. Not because they hate others, but because most social bonds are built upon subtle emotional extraction. The empath has run the cost-benefit analysis again and again, and the conclusion remains the same: connection without reciprocity equals depletion. They become selective not out of arrogance, but out of necessity. Their emotional energy is finite, and they refuse to spend it subsidizing the avoidance patterns of others. They are not waiting for people to change. They are simply done volunteering themselves as fuel. They are not against connection, they simply seek a rare form of it. A companionship without intrusion, without constant emotional pulling, without dependency masquerading as closeness. Two whole individuals walking side by side rather than merging into one another's survival strategies. Until such relationships exist, They prefer the intelligence of solitude over the noise of half-truths. They are not lonely. They are sovereign. Over time, this solitude crystallizes into a quiet gravity. They no longer leak emotional energy into every environment. They contain it. They move slowly. They no longer rush to respond, explain, or justify. Their silence is not emptiness, it is density. When they do speak, they do so with intention rather than performance. They don't seek approval because they have already resolved their relationship with judgment. They know who they are, shadows included, and that self-knowledge makes them unshakable in ways that confuse those still dependent on external affirmation. This is why Jung believed that wholeness, not normality, is the true aim of psychological development. The empath loner has paid dearly to arrive here. They have endured the death of roles they once clung to, the grief of letting people go, and the terror of discovering who they are without anyone else's emotional script. What remains is not bitterness. It is clarity. They no longer chase belonging in spaces that demand their fragmentation. They choose solitude not because they cannot connect, but because they refuse to do so at the cost of themselves. So the warning is not about danger in the conventional sense. Beware of empath loners not because they are vengeful or cold, but because they can no longer be used. You cannot manipulate someone who has withdrawn their worth from your approval. You cannot drain someone who has learned to seal their emotional boundaries. And you cannot own the loyalty of someone who has chosen truth over attachment. If you meet such a person, approach with respect. Do not mistake their silence for emptiness or their distance for weakness. If they let you near, know that it was not loneliness that opened the door, it was trust. And if you recognize yourself in this description, understand this: your solitude is not a collapse. It is a reconstruction. You did not disappear from the world. You finally reappeared to yourself.